Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. I appreciate you being with me so very, very much. Boy, here we are in May 2024. Yowie. You realize this year is almost half over already? I'm acutely aware of that. Yeah. It's astounding how fast time flies when you're getting older. Well, again, thank you so much for joining me here on Now TV and Morning Musings. We are currently involved and have been for a good little while in studying the challenge of Christ. The challenge of Christ is stated very simply by Jesus himself in John chapter 10, verse 37 and verse 38. If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Though you do not believe me for my words, believe me for my works. For they testify of me, is what Jesus was saying. And so we live in a world that is increasingly hostile toward Christianity. Hardly a day goes by that I don't, as I'm watching the news, as I'm watching TV, etc., that I do not hear, that I do not see someone ridiculing Christianity, scoffing at the Christian faith. Overt physical violence against Christianity is springing up in America at an unprecedented level. You know why? A whole lot of that is because the modern church has failed to answer the challenge of Christ. A lot of it is because, look, I had a gentleman walk into my office many, many years ago in a different town. He was actually our copier, repairman, etc. And when he walked in, he was just downcast, downtrodden. I said, dude, what's wrong? I said, you look like you just lost your very best friend. And he said, you know, Don, I'm not so sure that I have it. And I said, what do you mean? I was thinking marriage problems. He said, well, we just recently hired a new preacher. And he said a couple of weeks ago, he was giving a sermon. And he was talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And he said, now look, no one believes that Jesus was literally, physically raised from the dead. And that's not what matters. All that really matters is that you believe that he did. I said, he said that from the pulpit? He said, yeah. He said, I expected everyone in the audience to go, time out, you're gone. But he said, everybody just sat there. And he said, I began to ask some of the members of the congregation, what did you think about the sermon? Oh, I thought it was awesome. It was wonderful. Did you hear what he said? Well, yeah. I thought it was great. So we went to the preacher, he said, and I asked him, did I hear you right that you, number one, you don't believe that Jesus was physically raised from the dead, and number two, you don't think it's important that as Christians we believe that, but number three, the only thing that's really important is that we believe that he was, even if he wasn't. He said, yeah, that's exactly what I said. And he said, well, what's been the feedback on it? And he said, well, everyone thought it was just great. Listen to me, ladies and gentlemen. When we have men standing in the pulpits telling us that Jesus lied, that Jesus failed, that the biblical narrative concerning any of his works, okay? His death, burial, and resurrection. Paul said, if Christ is not risen, your faith is in vain. There are no two ways out of that. There's not a single way out of that. If he was not raised from the dead, his own challenge, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Then his own challenge disqualifies him as the Son of God. It disqualifies the Bible as the Word of God, which recounts for us his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And he said, Don, I don't know what to do, this guy that was in my office. He said, I simply cannot believe that anyone that would call themselves a Christian minister would say, I don't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. Well, it is difficult to believe, but folks, listen, we've got an awful lot of men standing in pulpits in America today, right here in my own town, several years ago. Now, he's gone now. A local minister got up and said basically the same thing. By the way, he happened to be of the same denomination as my friend. I won't mention that. When we have men standing in the pulpits today telling us that Jesus lied or he failed, that the Bible is wrong, it is little wonder that people who call themselves Christians, when they are confronted by the atheists, by the Muslims, by the Jews, who say, yeah, Jesus not only was not resurrected, he said he was going to come back in the first century on the clouds of heaven in judgment, and everyone knows he didn't do it, right? Your Jesus is a failure. Your Jesus was a liar, or he was a lunatic. Choose your poison. He failed his own challenge. So, folks, I've been sharing with you, how, number one, what the challenge is. Number two, how important it is that you and I, as believers, be able to respond to be able to answer that challenge. I cannot tell you the number of ministers that I encounter when I ask them, Jesus said he was coming back in the first century in judgment. Did he do it? And they kind of stand there stunned for a moment. And finally they say, well, no, he didn't do that. Really? You claim to be a Christian minister, and just like the minister in this denomination that I mentioned a few moments ago, you claim to be a Christian, and you say that Jesus failed or he lied, he was deluded? I have had people tell me to my face, it really doesn't matter if Jesus kept his word. All that we are asked to do is to believe on him. You know, this whole scenario, it doesn't matter if Jesus was really raised from the dead. All that really matters is that you believe that he did, or similar argumentation. I've posed the following challenge to people who have made that comment to me. Okay, so it doesn't matter if Jesus was actually physically raised from the dead. All that matters is that we believe that he was. I said, let's try that out in real life, not just in theology, not just in religion. Let's try that in real life. It doesn't matter whether or not I've actually got $1 million in the bank. All that really matters is that I believe that I do. Try that one on for size. Folks, you see how ridiculous? Argumentum ad desperatum? Do you see how ridiculous some so-called, they're not Christians. You'll have to excuse me for being so blunt. Anyone denies that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that he was raised from the dead, I'm sorry, you're not a Christian. That's the foundation of everything. And so we have people in the pews, we have men in the pulpits who, when it comes to the Bible, they're standing there preaching out of a book that they do not believe in. They're telling you to live your life for this fake, for this fraud, for this failure. And why should you? Good question, isn't it? If not, why not? So once again, I have been sharing with you how to encounter, how to answer the challenge of Christ when it comes to Jesus' prediction of his coming back on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory in judgment. He said he was going to do it in the lifetime of the first century audience that he was speaking to, Matthew 16, 27 and 28. Now, I've spent a good little while developing Daniel chapter 9, 24, and I'll be going back there, okay. But I shared with you last week that one of the greatest challenges that we face as believers in Jesus is the deep-seated belief on the part of many people. And it's certainly true on the part of, atheists and Muslims and Jews. And it's deep-seated in the Christian community. It is the belief that Jesus did, in fact, say that he was going to come back as a 5'5" physical Jewish man riding on a cumulus cloud at the end of human history. And he was either going to destroy literal physical creation, or he was going to recreate the earth and people going to live on the earth. Now, those are the standard views. But he also said he was going to do it in the first century, as I've already noted. So what I've shared with you over the last couple of weeks is that Daniel chapter 9 foretold 70 weeks are determined, cut out, appointed to bring in everlasting righteousness. I've shared with you that's a covenantal concept. Under the old covenant, under which Daniel was living, the old law could not provide righteousness. Galatians 3, 20 and 21. And so the promise of the coming in of everlasting righteousness was nothing less than the promise of a new covenant. The old covenant could not provide or make one righteous unless they were perfect, and they never were, and they could not be. So the promise of bringing in everlasting righteousness is a contrast between the old covenant that could never bring in righteousness, never impart righteousness, and a world and a covenant that can give righteousness. We are told repeatedly that the promise of Abraham that is given all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 17, Genesis chapter 21, was that the time was going to come in which men would be justified by faith and achieve righteousness by faith. That's critical. It is the contrast between the old covenant, the law of Moses, and the new covenant of Jesus Christ. Now, folks, what is righteousness? It is a right relationship with God that comes about when we are forgiven of our sin. Forgiveness equals righteousness. See, that's real simple. Lack of forgiveness brings alienation and death, not biological death, separation from God. That's what the Hebrew and the Greek word for death means, separation, alienation. So on the one hand, you have this massive contrast between the old covenant world that could not provide forgiveness, could not bring righteousness, and therefore brought death. After all, Paul called it the ministry or the ministration of death, versus the new covenant of life and righteousness. 2 Corinthians chapter 3. The first covenant had glory, but it could never bring forgiveness. The first covenant was glorious because it was given by God, but it could not bring righteousness or forgiveness. After all, the blood of bulls and goats can never take away sin. But the new covenant of Jesus Christ, based upon his one-time, for all time, perfect sacrifice, gives us forgiveness. It gives us righteousness. It gives us reconciliation with God. To go back to what I've shared with you over the last couple of weeks, sin brings alienation, which is death. Forgiveness brings righteousness and reconciliation, which is resurrection. You see, really, this is kind of simple, but in a way it's incredibly profound because the religious world as a whole has completely shunted this off to the side and said, well, okay, yeah, that's true at a spiritual level, but really we've got to have physical resurrection. No, we don't. Not to be righteous. We don't have to have physical resurrection to be forgiven. You see the problems here? But I've got to hurry. So Daniel foretold the bringing in of everlasting righteousness. Everlasting righteousness did not arrive at the time of the cross. Just this morning, before I came in to do this filming, someone responded to one of my videos and said, the work of Christ, the work of redemption, the work of salvation was completely and totally fulfilled and became a reality at the cross. Well, if that's true, how could Paul say in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 5, a passage I've shared with you a couple of times now, we through the Spirit, Paul said, writing in approximately 49 AD, said, eagerly await the hope of righteousness. Righteousness was their hope still. Now, if the work of Christ, bringing in everlasting righteousness, was completely fulfilled at the cross and became an objective reality at the cross, how could Paul say in Galatians 5:5 that they were still waiting for righteousness to come? And then we come to the real point, as I promised last week, of an examination of 2 Peter chapter 3. Now, I wrote a book, as you can see, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, a study of 2 Peter chapter 3. This is, to my knowledge, one of the most in-depth exegesis of 2 Peter chapter 3, and to my knowledge, it's the only full-length exegesis from the preterist perspective of 2 Peter chapter 3 that's ever been produced. Look, there may be something out there that I'm unaware of, but I am unaware of it if there's another book like it anywhere. If you'll go to my website, donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com, and if you go to the store and if you order the book, okay, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, and you say, Don, I saw your offer on Now TV about the book on 2 Peter chapter 3. If all you have to do is mention it, I will refund your shipping. That's going to cost you, or excuse me, it's going to save you between $6 and $7. Postage has gone way up. Get the book. Because what I'm going to share with you here on Now TV will be just a little smattering of what is in the book. But here's the deal. In Daniel 9, we are told 70 weeks are determined to bring in everlasting righteousness. Peter said they were eagerly awaiting the day of the Lord, in which, he said, the heavens and the earth shall pass away, and the earth and the elements that are therein shall be burned up. And then he said, nevertheless, according to his promise. What promise? The passing of heaven and earth. According to his promise, we look for a new heaven and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. Oh, so what does that mean? That means that when Paul said, through the Spirit we're eagerly awaiting the hope of righteousness, that means he was looking for the new heaven and new earth wherein dwells righteousness. Unless Paul was looking for something different from what Peter was talking about. And so about this time, someone says, well, yeah, but Don, here's the fact. Peter says that world of righteousness would come when heaven and earth would be destroyed, burned up, as most people believe. It's actually a little more properly, a little more accurately, shall be revealed or discovered. That's an interesting concept. I won't go into it this morning. But here's the point. Peter was looking for the new heaven and the new earth wherein dwells everlasting righteousness. So once again, if everlasting righteousness was fully accomplished at the cross, if it became an objective reality at the moment of the cross and the death of Jesus, then Paul was wrong, or he was speaking of something totally different, to write in 49 AD, a decade and a half after the cross, that he was looking for the arrival of everlasting righteousness. And likewise, if everlasting righteousness was fully established objectively at the time of the cross, then how could Peter say they were looking for, and that word looking there means a very eager, expectant looking for. It's an urgent looking for. Prosdechomai. The new heaven and new earth, which was made by the Old Testament prophets. But here's Peter, writing in the 60s, still looking for the world of everlasting righteousness. So how could the world of everlasting righteousness have been brought in at the time of the cross? And there's another element of this. I've already shared with you that the bringing in of everlasting righteousness is all about the establishment of the new covenant. Do you remember? Old covenant could not bring in everlasting righteousness. The old covenant could not provide forgiveness of sin, therefore could not make a person righteous. Could not bring him into that right relationship with God, could not reconcile him to God, could not resurrect him from sin, death. Okay? But the promise, therefore, here's the problem with the old covenant. But the promise of a new heaven and new earth wherein dwells everlasting righteousness is therefore nothing less than the promise of the new covenant. Because you see, Jeremiah 31, 29 to 31, God said, the days are coming, says the Lord, in which I will make a new heaven and in which I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Jacob, not according to the covenant that I made with them when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, says the Lord, because this is the covenant that I will make with them. I will put my law, I will put my word in their heart, in their minds, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. Folks, do you remember what happened under the old covenant? Sin was remembered every year. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 2. The old law brought sin to a reminder, kept it ever in front of the audience. But the new covenant was going to do exactly the opposite. Now, I've got to point something out in regard to this righteousness issue. In Isaiah chapter 64 and verse 8, the prophet, living under the law, said, all of our righteousnesses, and he uses that term, all of our righteousnesses are as filthy rags before you. Now, you'll have to excuse me, but I want you to get the graphic picture. For mature audiences only. All of our righteousnesses are as bloody menstrual rags before you. That's the imagery. That's the language of Isaiah chapter 64. That's the futility of the old law. Old law, no righteousness, because no forgiveness. New covenant, forgiveness, righteousness, a right relationship, and thus reconciliation and resurrection. I keep repeating that. I hope you catch the power of it. So, when we come to 2 Peter chapter 3, and Peter is reminding us that his prediction of the new heaven and new earth is taken from the Old Testament. Okay? The Old Testament prophets. We'll develop this a whole lot more as we continue. And he predicts the passing of one world and the bringing in of another world. He predicts the passing of an old world of unrighteousness. The passing of a world of futility. There's an important word. And the bringing in of a world of everlasting righteousness, where man would be brought into, through faith, under the new covenant, man would be reconciled to God. And being reconciled, they would be righteous, and being righteous, they would be resurrected. I hope you're beginning to see that the story of biblical eschatology is about the end of an old covenant of unrighteousness, a covenant that only brought death and futility, unrighteousness, although it was intended to bring life, versus a new covenant that can give life, that can give righteousness, because it brings forgiveness of sin. So, once again, next week we're going to start taking this deep dive into 2 Peter chapter 3. Get this book. You'll be glad you did.